The storm arrived like a fist striking glass. One moment, the air was thick and still, a suffocating blanket damp with the promise of rain, smelling of wet earth and something else, something sweet and decaying from the jungle that pressed in on all sides. The next, the sky tore open. Not with a crash of thunder first, but with a blinding, impossible flash that bleached the world white, followed an instant later by a sound so deep and violent it felt less like hearing and more like being hit. Then the rain came. It wasn't rain as Alex knew it. This was a deluge, a furious cascade that pounded on the corrugated tin roof of the small bungalow like a million tiny hammers wielded by something enraged. It roared in the trees, a relentless, hissing wave of sound that drowned out everything else. The wooden walls, warped and weathered by countless seasons, seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Outside, the world vanished into a gray, churning blur. The air inside the single room grew instantly colder, but still heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew that had seeped into everything here. Alex huddled on the worn rattan mat covering the floor, a thin blanket clutched around their shoulders, though the chill was more from nerves than actual cold. The single flickering fluorescent tube above buzzed intermittently, threatening to die completely with each particularly violent gust that shook the bungalow. They were miles from the nearest town, deep in a small village nestled precariously at the edge of the rainforest. The sounds of the kampung, usually a mix of distant radios, children's shouts, and the constant hum of insects, were completely silenced by the storm. Isolation pressed in, heavy and absolute. They had come here seeking authenticity, a break from the sterile predictability of home, eager to immerse themselves in a culture vastly different from their own. They'd found it, certainly. But the authenticity wasn't just in the vibrant markets and the intricate temples. It was also in the raw, untamed power of the elements, the unsettling closeness of the jungle, and the way the darkness here felt ancient and watchful. And it was in the things you found in the dusty corners, the items that seemed to carry the weight of unseen histories. Like the VCD. Alex's eyes drifted to where it lay on the small, wobbly wooden table beside a half-empty glass of water. It wasn't even a proper VCD case, just a clear plastic sleeve containing a disc with a crudely written label in thick, faded marker pen. Bonica Houghton. Jungle Puppet. They'd bought it in a chaotic, overflowing junk shop in town, a place where old electronics mingled with religious effigies, cracked porcelain, and forgotten photographs. It had cost next to nothing, picked up on impulse because the handwritten title and the utter lack of any other information had piqued their curiosity. Now, with the storm raging and the power threatening to fail, curiosity felt like a very bad idea. Every instinct screamed against putting the disc into the battered portable VCD player they'd also picked up cheap. The atmosphere in the room felt expectant. The air itself seemed to hum with a low, unpleasant frequency beneath the roar of the rain. But boredom, and a desperate need for distraction from the terrifying symphony outside, warred with the unease. There was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. The silence, if the rain were to somehow stop, felt even more frightening than the noise. Slowly, reluctantly, Alex reached for the player, its plastic casing scuffed and discolored. They plugged it into the wall socket, wincing slightly as the power flickered. The green light on the player glowed weakly. They picked up the VCD, the plastic sleeve feeling slightly greasy. Sliding the disc out, they noted a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the playing surface, too faint to be dirt, more like a discoloration in the material itself. They slotted it into the tray. The whirring sound of the player felt unnervingly loud in the room. The screen of the player, small and low resolution, flickered to life. No menu appeared. The disc simply started playing. The image was grainy, the colors washed out, but immediately unsettling. It showed a simple, static scene, a roughly painted backdrop of green jungle leaves and brown earth. In the center were two puppets. They were handmade, crudely stitched from dull, faded fabric. One was vaguely humanoid, like a simplified doll wearing ill-fitting clothes. The other was amorphous, a lumpy shape that seemed to sway slightly even though the image was still. They both had large, mismatched buttons for eyes, but the angle or the lighting made them appear to stare directly outwards, right at the viewer. There was no music. no dialogue. For several long seconds, nothing at all happened. The storm roared outside. Inside, the only sound was the low whirring of the player and Alex's own shallow breathing. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the humanoid puppet's head tilted to the side. It didn't look like a string being pulled. It looked like something inside was shifting. There was a faint, scraping sound that seemed to come from the player, but also somehow from the storm outside. Then the lumpy puppet twitched, a sudden, jerky movement that was completely unnatural. Its button eyes seemed to glint. Alex felt a prickle of fear, cold and sharp, crawl up their spine. This wasn't just bad children's programming. It felt wrong. Fundamentally, unsettlingly wrong. The movements were too slow, too deliberate, then too sudden. There was a profound emptiness to the scene, a vacuum where sound or action should be. The puppets just existed, staring. The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer just from the darkness outside, but from the grainy screen itself. It felt like those button eyes were looking through the screen, into the room. The storm outside seemed to lend its fury to the scene, somehow enhancing the sense of dread. Alex wanted to turn it off, but their hand felt heavy, rooted to the mat. On the screen, the humanoid puppet tilted its head further, and a seam on its face seemed to bulge slightly, like something was pushing against the fabric from within. The old wooden door creaked shut behind them, the heavy bolt sliding home with a resonant thud that echoed unervingly in the sudden silence of the stone hall. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers in a language they didn't understand. Liam turned from the door, his hand still resting on the cold, rough iron of the bolt. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of dust, damp stone, and something else, something faintly metallic and organic, like old, dried blood mixed with soil. The hall was vast and cavernous, stretching into gloom both ahead and upwards. High overhead, unseen rafters groaned softly in response to the wind's unseen push. Narrow, dirt-streaked windows set deep in the thick walls offered only weak, failing light, illuminating dancing motes of dust suspended in the frigid air. Tapestries hung limply on the walls, their once vibrant colors faded to somber browns and greens, depicting scenes that were difficult to discern in the poor light but seemed to involve contorted figures and stark, angular landscapes. A massive, blackened fireplace dominated one wall, filled with a cold, dead hearth that radiated an absence of warmth. "Well," Liam said, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness, "we're here." Chloe shivered, pulling her coat tighter. "It's cold. And smells awful." She didn't need to elaborate on the awful smell. It was a cloying, underlying scent that prickled at the back of the throat. "Are you sure this is the right place, Liam? The villagers were very insistent we shouldn't come here." Liam nodded slowly, scanning the shadows. The maps and the old texts match. This is the estate the archives mentioned. Isolated, supposedly empty for decades. He tried for a reassuring smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just settling in. Old houses make noise." They took hesitant steps forward, their boots echoing on the stone floor. To their left, a wide archway led into what might have been a sitting room or parlor. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, creating eerie, slumped shapes in the dim light. As Chloe passed one, she caught a glimpse of something beneath the sheet, not the smooth curve of a chair back, but a sharp, irregular shape, almost like bundled sticks or distorted limbs. She quickly averted her gaze, her heart giving a nervous lurch. On a mantelpiece above a smaller, equally cold fireplace, a collection of wooden figures stood guard. They weren't decorative carvings of people or animals, but crude, unsettling effigies. Twisted, elongated bodies bound with coarse twine, faceless heads, or heads with features carved into permanent screams or vacant stares. Some were marked with symbols she didn't recognize from any folk art catalog she'd studied. They seemed less like art and more like grim talismans or discarded ritual objects. Liam moved towards a heavy wooden door at the far end of the hall. "Let's see if we can find the main living quarters. Or better yet, something to make light." As he reached for the door handle, a sound echoed from upstairs. It wasn't the groan of wood or the rattle of a window. It was a distinct, soft dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled slowly across a wooden floor directly above them. They froze, listening intently. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The house went silent save for the frantic pounding of their own hearts. The dragging sound stopped. "Rats," Liam whispered, though his eyes were wide. Or maybe just the wind getting in somewhere upstairs, catching something. Chloe didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the dark ceiling above. The air felt even colder now, prickling with an unseen static energy. The unsettling smell seemed to intensify, filling her lungs with its foul sweetness. She felt an overwhelming urge to turn and run back out the way they came, back into the wind and the fading light, away from the oppressive darkness and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Let's find the lamps first," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We need light before we explore anything else. Especially upstairs." Liam swallowed hard, visibly forcing himself to lower his hand from the door handle. "Right. Light. Good idea." He backed away from the door, glancing nervously up the grand, sweeping staircase that ascended into the darkness near the back of the hall. Each step of the staircase seemed deeper in shadow than the last, leading into an impenetrable blackness from which the sound had come. They turned their attention back to the ground floor, searching for a less ominous path. They found a corridor leading off the main hall, lined with closed doors. The corridor was narrower, darker, the dust heavier. Here, the strange scent was stronger, mingled with the smell of mildew and something else, earthy, like freshly turned grave soil. On the wall beside one door, a symbol was etched into the plaster, a complex pattern of intersecting lines and curves that looked vaguely familiar from her research into regional protective wards, but distorted, twisted into something that looked less like a shield and more like a trap. Liam ran his fingers over the symbol. "Never seen this variation before," he murmured, his researcher's curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "It's similar to the knot of binding they used in the lower villages, but different." As his finger traced the lines, the air around the symbol seemed to grow perceptibly colder. He snatched his hand back as if burned. "Okay," he said, his voice tighter. "Let's definitely focus on finding the lamps." "The cellar?" Sometimes they kept oil and supplies in the cellar. The prospect of going into a cellar in this house was less than appealing, but it was better than exploring the upper floors in the dark. They located another heavy door, this one set low in the wall, leading downwards. It groaned as Liam wrestled it open, revealing a set of rough stone steps descending into a pitch-black void from which the smell of damp earth and decay rose like a physical entity. Armed with a single, weak flashlight from their pack, they began their descent into the cellar's suffocating darkness. Each step creaked ominously under their weight. The cold intensified, seeping into their bones. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the single beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a space choked with cobwebs and shadow. And from directly above them, just above the cellar door they had just closed, they heard it again. Not a scrape or a drag this time, but a distinct, heavy thump. Followed by another. A slow, deliberate rhythm, like something large and heavy was being dropped onto the floor, directly above their heads. Alex spun, a choked gasp tearing from their throat, hands flying up instinctively as if to ward off whatever stood behind them. But there was nothing. Just the empty space of the small, forgotten room in the back of the old guest house. Moonlight, thin and dusty, slanted through the single grimy window, illuminating only motes dancing in the air and the rough, uneven stone floor. The air was still, thick with the scent of ancient wood, mildew, and something else faint and unpleasant, like dried earth and old, cool iron. Heart hammering against their ribs like a trapped bird, Alex slowly lowered their hands, eyes scanning the shadows pooled in the corners, under the sagging wooden table, behind the single heavy cabinet against the far wall. Nothing moved. Only the faint sound of their own ragged breathing filled the silence. Swallowing hard, Alex turned back to the box on the floor. It was an old thing, heavy and dark, bound with tarnished brass. The lid they had just pried open reflected nothing now but the dusty room, distorted by the uneven surface. Had it been a trick of the light? Exhaustion playing tricks on their eyes in the oppressive stillness of the night? They knelt again, forcing their trembling hands to reach into the box. Nestled on faded, brittle velvet lay the object that had caught their attention. It was a carving of dark, dense wood, small enough to fit in a clenched fist. But the form it depicted was deeply unsettling. It was vaguely humanoid, but elongated and distorted, with limbs too long and thin, and a head that seemed mostly gaping mouth and wide, empty sockets. It was bound tightly with what looked like dried strips of leather or sinew, wrapped around it crisscross fashion, securing it to a small, flat piece of bone. Tucked beneath the bindings was a scrap of faded, intricately embroidered silk, the colors long bled and muted. Alex lifted it carefully. The wood felt unnaturally cold against their skin. The bindings were brittle, threatening to snap. There were symbols carved into the bone piece, ancient and unfamiliar, resembling script they had seen on temple ruins nearby, though more crude, more urgent. A wave of unease, cold and sharp, washed over Alex. This felt wrong. Deeply, intrinsically wrong. It wasn't just an old curio. It felt heavy with purpose, with history, with something that should have remained buried. The memory of the village elder's words, spoken in hushed tones through their translator earlier that week, returned unbidden. "Do not wander near the old places after dark," the elder had warned, their gaze distant and troubled. "Do not disturb what slumbers. There are things that walk when the moon is high, things that crave." They had trailed off, making a gesture Alex hadn't understood, something about the throat and emptiness. Other villagers had avoided talking about it, their faces tightening, eyes flicking nervously towards the distant, tree-shrouded hills where the ancient ruins lay, and where Alex's guesthouse, an old colonial-era building on the outskirts, was situated. They spoke of Po Nyan, not as a single entity, but a category of hungry spirits, often bound to places or objects, disturbed by the living. Was this carving one of those objects? A binding? Or something else? Alex's gaze drifted towards the door. The house felt different now. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it felt active, watchful. Every creak of the ancient timber frames, every whisper of wind through the ill-fitting window pane seemed amplified, distorted. Alex held their breath, listening intently. Was that the rustle of something in the next room? The soft shifting of weight upstairs? Or was it just their own fear twisting ordinary house sounds? They ran a thumb over the bone piece. The symbols felt sharp under their skin. The carving seemed to writhe slightly in their hand, or perhaps it was just their own trembling. The empty sockets of its carved face seemed to stare up at them, accusingly. It felt like holding something alive, something malevolent. A sudden, distinct sound broke the silence. Not a creak or a groan, but a soft, deliberate scrape from just outside the door. Like something being slowly dragged across the wooden floor of the hallway. Alex froze, muscles locked, the carving still clenched in their hand. Their blood ran cold. It wasn't a sound the old house usually made. It wasn't wind. It wasn't settling. The scraping stopped. Silence descended again, thicker and more suffocating than before. Alex's heart hammered against their ribs, a frantic, deafening rhythm in their ears. They strained to listen, every nerve ending screaming. Then, soft, almost inaudible, came a sound from directly outside the door. It was like a shallow breath, held, then slowly released. Followed by a low, guttural murmur, too soft to distinguish words, but undeniably close. Too close. The silence outside was suddenly heavier than any sound. It pressed against the old house, a palpable weight in the deep night. Alex stood by the cold hearth in the main room, the faint scent of stale smoke and something else, something earthy and damp, clinging to the air. The only sounds were the subtle shifts and groans of the ancient structure settling around them, noises that in the daytime seemed merely the size of age, but now felt like watchful breaths. The village outside was utterly dark. No light spilled from the few scattered windows. The inhabitants here kept to strict, early hours after sundown, a custom Alex had initially found quaint but now felt increasingly ominous. They spoke in low tones about the darkness, about the things that stirred when the sun went down. Alex had tried to ask old Grigori down the lane, the one with the eyes that seemed too large and too knowing, about the forest that pressed close against the village's edge. Grigori had merely made a sign with his hand, a quick warding gesture Alex didn't recognize, and muttered something in the local dialect about the old path and those who walk the quiet hours. Now, in this suffocating silence, Alex thought of Grigori's fear, and the fear in the eyes of the other villagers when the topic of night or the forest path arose. It wasn't just caution, it was deep-seated dread. Then, a sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the internal noises of the house and the pounding of Alex's own heart. A rhythmic sound, coming from outside, from the direction of the overgrown lane that led away from the back of the house towards the edge of the woods. Thump, scrape. Thump, scrape. It was slow, deliberate. Too steady for an animal foraging. Too slow and uneven for any kind of machinery Alex could imagine in this remote place. It continued, a measured, unsettling pulse against the night. Thump, scrape. Thump, scrape. Alex moved quietly through the dark room, navigating by memory towards the window that faced the rear of the property and the dark line of the forest beyond. The floorboards creaked despite the careful steps. Each sound in the house felt amplified, a betrayal in the stillness. Reaching the window, Alex paused, listening intently. The sound was clearer here, cutting through the silence with unnerving precision. Thump, scrape. It sounded like something heavy being moved, dragged maybe, with a kind of dull impact before the scrape. But what? And why out there, in the absolute dark, on that rarely used path? Alex pressed closer to the cold glass, peering out. The moon, a sliver high in the inky sky, offered scant light, casting long, distorted shadows from the gnarled trees at the forest's edge. The path itself was invisible, swallowed by shadow and undergrowth. There was nothing to see, no shape moving, no light to indicate a person with a lantern. Just the oppressive darkness and the relentless, unsettling sound. Thump, scrape. Thump, scrape. It didn't vary in rhythm or intensity. It was maddeningly consistent. It felt unnatural, like a clockwork mechanism wound tight and set to tick in the dark. A shiver traced its way down Alex's spine, not from the cold glass but from something deeper, a primal unease that whispered of things that should not be. Alex thought again of Grigori's warning, of the hushed talk of the quiet hours. They said things walked then. Things that weren't people. Superstition, Alex had told themselves. Stories to keep children indoors. But the sound was real. It was out there. And was it getting closer? Or was it just the focus of Alex's attention, drawing it nearer in the mind? The rhythm felt slightly louder now, the individual elements of the thump and the scrape more distinct. Thump, scrape. Thump, scrape. An intense wave of cold, sharp and absolute, seemed to emanate from the window, or perhaps from outside. It was not the chill of the night air, but something that felt like it reached into the chest and squeezed. It was the cold of profound dread. Alex pulled back from the glass, retreating into the deeper shadows of the room. Every instinct screamed to hide, to make no noise, to simply cease to exist until morning. The sound continued, a relentless background beat to Alex's own frantic pulse. Thump, scrape. Then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. It was expectant, tense, charged with a lingering presence. Alex held their breath, straining to hear anything else. The house creaked. The wind whispered faintly outside, a sound that now felt normal, even welcome, against the recent quiet horror. Silence. Utter, complete silence. For perhaps a full minute, nothing happened. Alex started to wonder if they had imagined it, if the isolation and the creepy atmosphere of this place were finally getting to them. Then, a new sound. Right outside the window Alex had just retreated from. Tap, tap, tap. Soft. Delicate. Distinct. Not the heavy thump and scrape, but a light, rhythmic tapping against the glass. Like a fingernail. Or something hard and small. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate, just like the earlier sound, but closer. Intimately close. It was right there. Alex froze, every muscle locked. The blood roared in their ears, drowning out even the tapping for a moment. The tapping repeated, slightly louder this time, insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Against the cold glass. Separated only by a pane of glass from whatever was making that sound in the dead of night, in this forgotten place, with its hushed warnings and its heavy, ancient silence. Alex stared at the dark rectangle of the window, the glass reflecting only the faint, distorted outline of the room and the darkness within. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. It demanded attention. It demanded to be seen. Alex had to look. Had to see what was there. The cicadas, a moment before a deafening wall of sound outside the storehouse, were gone. Not faded, but simply extinguished, as if a vast, invisible hand had pressed down on the entire valley. The silence that descended was more profound than any quiet they had ever known, a heavy, suffocating blanket pulled tight around the old wooden building. Alistair felt it press against his eardrums, a physical weight that made his head swim. Chloe beside him gasped, a small, sharp sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden void. The crude wooden figure sat on the worn tatami mat inside the box, nestled beside the tight, dark bundle of human hair. It was roughly carved, almost childlike in its simplicity, yet it possessed a disturbing stillness. No distinct features, just a head and body shape, arms pressed close to its sides, but the wood felt ancient, smooth with time and handling, somehow radiating a chill that was far colder than the air. The hair was thick, black, bound tightly with thin, brittle twine. It looked old, faded in places, but undeniably human. "What is this?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Alistair didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the objects, then flicking nervously towards the open door of the storehouse. The golden light of the late afternoon sun still slanted through the doorway, illuminating the dusty motes dancing in the air, but it felt wrong, somehow diminished by the oppressive silence. The air inside had indeed grown colder, a penetrating damp chill that seemed to come from the objects themselves, clinging to their skin like mist. "I don't know," Alistair finally said, his voice hushed. "But, we shouldn't touch it." A primal instinct screamed at him to close the box, shove it back where they found it, and leave this village immediately. This wasn't historical research anymore. This felt wrong. Deeply, anciently wrong. The silence outside held, absolute and unnerving. Where were the birds? The wind rustling the leaves? The distant sound of the stream? Nothing. Just this heavy, expectant quiet. "We should go," Chloe urged, taking a hesitant step back. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the bundle of hair. Alistair nodded, agreeing instantly. He carefully pushed the lid of the old wooden box back down, its hinge groaning slightly, a sound that echoed in the unnatural quiet. He didn't put the box back behind the scrolls. He just left it there on the tatami, exposed, a silent challenge or offering to whatever force had clamped down on the valley. Leaving it felt safer than disturbing its resting place further. They backed out of the storehouse slowly, not turning their backs on the interior until they were through the doorway. Stepping outside didn't break the silence. It followed them, clinging to the dusty path, wrapping around the weathered wooden walls of the surrounding buildings. The village felt deserted. Empty. The small rice paddies nearby were still, the water reflecting the darkening sky like sheets of black glass. No movement, no sound of anyone working in their fields, no children's voices, no distant radio playing. Walking back towards the center of the village, towards the small guest house where they were staying, felt like traversing a stage after everyone had left, but the actors were still hiding just out of sight, watching. The traditional wooden houses with their dark tiled roofs and sliding paper doors looked different now, less charmingly rustic, more like silent, watchful sentinels. The air grew heavier with every step, charged with an unseen energy that prickled the hairs on Alistair's arms. He kept glancing at the dense, dark woods that bordered the village, a wall of ancient trees pressing in. They seemed closer now, darker. They reached the guest house, its familiar facade offering little comfort. The paper lanterns hanging by the entrance were still, unswaying in the absolute lack of wind. The small garden looked overgrown, somehow more wild than it had that morning. Alistair slid the wooden gate open, the sound of it grating on the stone path startlingly loud. They entered the small courtyard, relief a fleeting thing quickly swallowed by the pervasive unease. Inside, the guest house was just as silent. The air here was cold too, the same penetrating chill from the storehouse. Alistair called out, "Sumiko-san? Are you there?" His voice sounded thin, swallowed by the silence of the house. No answer. The elderly woman who ran the guest house, always bustling, always ready with tea or a quiet word, was nowhere to be seen. Her sandals were by the door, neatly placed. They went to their room, sliding the fusuma door open. It looked the same, the futons neatly folded in the corner, the low table, the single window looking out onto the garden. But it felt wrong. Alien. Alistair crossed to the window, peering out. The garden was darkening rapidly. A shape moved at the edge of his vision, near the dense rhododendron bushes. He spun around, but nothing was there. Just shadows deepening. Chloe had frozen by the door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Alistair strained his ears. At first, nothing. Then, a faint sound. A scraping. From beneath the floorboards? Or inside the walls? It was subtle, like claws on wood, or something being dragged slowly across a rough surface. It stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Then, a different sound. A soft, wet thump against the outer wall of the guest house, just beside their room. Followed by another. And another. Like something heavy and soft was being thrown against the wood, rhythmically, gently. They stared at each other, eyes wide with terror, unable to move, listening to the chilling, rhythmic impact outside their door. The silence of the valley had been broken, not by the return of natural sounds, but by something far more terrifying. The air in the hidden passageway was different, heavy and damp, thick with the smell of disturbed earth and something else, something cloying and sweet, like rotten fruit left too long in a sunless place. Alex lowered the old lantern, its weak flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The floor beneath his worn boots was rough-hewn stone, slick with a thin layer of moisture that glistened sickly in the uncertain light. Each step echoed unnervingly in the confined space, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive quiet that pressed in from all sides. This was not part of the farmhouse he'd been staying in. It felt older, buried, a forgotten vein in the land itself. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy and smelling faintly of dust and decay, clung to his face and arms as he moved deeper. They seemed to pulse slightly in the lantern's heat. He swatted them away, a shiver crawling down his spine that had nothing to do with the chill seeping from the stone walls. The passage sloped downwards gradually, the air growing colder, the strange, sweet smell intensifying. It mingled now with the metallic tang of something else, something Alex couldn't quite place, but which set his teeth on edge. He rounded a bend, the passage widening slightly into a small, uneven chamber. The ceiling here was lower, the stone walls rougher, as if hastily carved. In the center sat a low, flat stone, dark and stained. Around it, scattered on the damp floor, were objects that made Alex's breath hitch. Crude effigies made of bound twigs and dark cloth, some adorned with dried flowers or feathers. Small, intricately carved wooden figures that resembled distorted human forms. And clay pots, some broken, revealing dried, dark substances within. A faint, reddish-brown smear was visible on the central stone. It looked disturbingly like dried blood. His gaze swept across the chamber, the lantern beam jumping nervously. On the far wall, etched deeply into the stone, was a symbol he'd seen before, faintly visible on the old farmhouse doorframe, and on a charm worn by the elderly woman who sometimes brought supplies to the village. It was a complex knot-like design, but with sharp, angular edges that seemed to claw at the eye. Here, however, it was larger, more prominent, and radiating a palpable sense of malevolence that the smaller versions lacked. Below it, arranged in a semicircle, were more objects, smooth river stones painted with the same knot-like symbol, and small bundles of dried herbs, tied with rough twine. The smell of these herbs, even dried, was potent and unfamiliar, sharp and bitter beneath the lingering sweetness. A sudden skittering sound from the shadows behind him made him jump, spinning around, the lantern swinging wildly. It was probably just a rat, he told himself, trying to calm his hammering heart. But the sound had been too heavy for a rat, too deliberate. And it hadn't sounded like it scurried away. He turned back to the chamber, his hand trembling slightly as he held the lantern. The silence that followed the sound was even more unnerving than the sound itself. It felt expectant, waiting. He forced himself to look closer at the central stone. There were more etchings on it, almost worn smooth by time or use. He crouched down, holding the lantern closer. They were symbols too, similar to the large one on the wall, but smaller, interspersed with lines and dots that formed no recognizable pattern. As his light played over them, he noticed a thin, almost invisible line running from the stone towards a small drain set into the floor at the edge of the chamber. The reddish-brown stain followed this line. A bead of sweat traced a cold path down his temple. This wasn't just storage. This was something else. Something old and ritualistic. He thought of the local legends he'd vaguely heard, stories of spirits tied to the land, of ancient practices meant to appease or ward off unseen forces. The knot symbol, the old woman's charm, was meant to protect against the whispering shadows, a local term for malevolent spirits. Was this chamber related? Was this where those whispers originated? A faint whisper did seem to drift into the chamber then, not from behind him, but from further down a narrow opening he hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows behind the central stone. It was too soft to distinguish words, just a sibilant, rustling sound like dry leaves being dragged across stone. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, to scramble back up the passage and seal the hidden door, to pretend he'd never found this place. But the sound, the sheer mystery and horror of it, held him rooted to the spot. Curiosity, morbid and dangerous, warred with his rising panic. He edged closer to the narrow opening, raising the lantern. The passage beyond was even narrower, plunging into absolute blackness where the lantern light couldn't reach. The whisper was clearer now, a low, grating sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It sounded like something was trying to speak, or perhaps, struggling. The sweet, foul smell was overpowering here, thick enough to taste. And mixed with it now, stronger than ever, was that metallic tang. It suddenly clicked, it smelled like iron, like old, dried blood. The whispers seemed to beckon him, to promise some terrible revelation just beyond the veil of darkness. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever was making that sound, whatever lay beyond that opening, was not meant for human eyes or ears. But the pull was undeniable. He took a shaky breath, the foul air burning his lungs, and stepped towards the darkness. The whisper seemed to grow louder, changing pitch, becoming less like rustling leaves and more like a hungry sigh.